Democracy and Islam.
Democracy is un-Islamic. So you have to believe and understand this. The concept of democracy, the concept of voting is totally un-Islamic.
In our present world of today, one of the greatest edict of Islam is democracy. Because frankly speaking, democracy is a disbelief. And I believe in my earlier analysis of Quran chapter 5 verse 44 to 48, I've been able to establish that.
Democracy and Islam.
Can you now see? God has called those who, refuse to rule their society with God's law. He has called them three awful names now. The first one is unbelievers. The second one, he called them evildoers. And now he's calling them sinners. You now see out of these three awful names, out of these three terrible names, the one that is most terrible there is that unbeliever. And I will tell you why. It is a very dangerous name to call anybody in Islam. I will tell you why in the course of the video. Let's quickly finish up with this passage. In verse 48, we read, and we read to you the book with the truth. And we read it to you the book with truth. Now, God is now coming back to the Quran. He has talked of the Old Testament Bible. He has talked of the New Testament Bible. God is now coming home to the Quran. He's now directing it again to Muslims, confirming the scripture that preceded it. We have reviewed this book, the Quran, with the truth, confirming the scriptures that preceded it and superseding it. So judge, can you see? So judge between them according to what God revealed, and do not follow their desires. So you see, God is equally telling us Muslims that we should judge, we should rule our society, we should judge our affairs by what He has revealed in the Quran. So you now see where the terrorists are coming from. When terrorists, see Muslims as legitimate targets, it is because they believe these Muslims have refused to rule according to what God has revealed. And by the virtues of these verses that we have enumerated, they have incurred that name, that terrible name, unbeliever. And so they are legitimate targets for attack. So we have seen in the passages that we read just now how God lay emphasis on the importance of using the laws He has revealed in His book, to use it to judge, to rule our society. Now, you will understand where the terrorists are coming from. One mantra that is very common to this terrorist group is the shout of Sharia, Sharia. They are always shouting Sharia. This is because terrorists see Muslims and non-Muslims who have submitted to this common law, to this law that is not revealed by God, to this man-made law. Terrorists see everybody that have submitted to that law as legitimate target for attack. They see them as unbelievers. So I now wonder, our Islamic scholars in Southwest Nigeria, don't they know this? I'm sure they know this. They are just trying to, deny the truth. They are just trying to deny the fact. And it is better we face the facts, so that our kids will already know this, instead of them hearing it elsewhere. Let us face this, bring the facts in the open. Then we'll now come up with superior arguments to counter these terrorists. We'll now come up with context that can, render this their argument useless.
Democracy and Islam.
Now, in all fairness, terrorism or not, if you consider Quran chapter 5, verse 45 to 48, you will see that it places a burden on a believer. It places a burden on a Muslim to always seek for a society that is governed by God's law. Now, the pertinent question to ask is, at what cost? In the event that a believer does not have the required number or does not have the required strength, to enforce this kind of society, the pertinent question to ask is the believer's faith still sufficient enough to earn in paradise in the sight of Allah? Because when you see the way terrorists go about this passage of the Quran, they interpret it to mean that having a society governed by God's law is a do or die affair. And a believer must always strive for this, regime change that will enforce this kind of society. So in other words, is it true, like terrorists think, that any believer who does not work towards having a society governed by Sharia, that individual, that believer, has fallen short of the minimum requirement to gain Allah's pleasure and to earn paradise? Because by virtue of the passage of the Quran that we are considering, it places a burden, it places a responsibility on every Muslim, on every believer to work towards having a society that is governed by Allah's law. Now, the question now is, at what cost? Is a believer allowed to shed blood in order to achieve this? And in the event that the believer does not have the wherewithal to, enforce this kind of society? Is his faith still intact? And can that faith still reign in paradise in the sight of Allah? I think to answer that question, we will need to look beyond Prophet Muhammad. Because when we say a believer, strictly speaking, when we say somebody is a believer, we are not talking of somebody that is a follower of Prophet Muhammad, or we are not just talking of Islam as brought to us by Prophet Muhammad. No, we are actually saying a believer that believes in God. And when you talk of believing in God, it means you have to believe in the whole prophets, from Prophet Adam all the way to Prophet Muhammad, and see if there are lessons that can be, drawn from the lives of these prophets that came before Prophet Muhammad, and we will now see if there are lessons we can draw from them that is pertinent to this discussion. You see, in actual fact, in arriving at an holistic evaluation of God's character, Prophet Muhammad is not sufficient for us to study as a data in that regard. That is because Prophet Muhammad, though he is a prominent prophet, he is the last of the prophets, he does not represent the whole body of prophets. It does not represent the whole system of the prophets. Now, in answering the question of must a believer, seek regime change in order to perfect his faith? Must a believer seek regime change at the cost of shedding blood? We need to look beyond the life of Prophet Muhammad. We need to look through the history of all the prophets, right from Prophet Adam all the way to Prophet Muhammad. We will now see if there are examples of believers who had lived under a secular government and were still able, to seek Allah's pleasure, and were still able, to practice their faith sufficiently enough, to earn paradise. It amuses me whenever in a religious discussion, you see Muslims, they are quick to, say that all the prophets that came before Prophet Muhammad, that they are Muslims. Technically, they are right, but we don't seem to, appreciate the practical implication of that statement. When we say all the prophets that came before Prophet Muhammad are Muslim, what it actually means is that it places a burden on us. It places a responsibility on us to, emulate these prophets, to, draw lessons from their life wherever it is, relevant. And in answering this question of whether, as a believer, whether your faith is complete with or without seeking a regime change, whether you will be able to, seek Allah's pleasure and earn paradise with or without seeking a regime change, it will be pertinent to look at the life of, Prophet Joseph, how he lived under a secular government, and he was able to use his God-given knowledge to help that, regime to succeed. That regime was not a Sharia governing regime. It was not governed by the Torah. It was not governed by God's law. In fact, the regime is an adulterous regime. But yet, Prophet Joseph was, very comfortable in that regime, and was able to use his God-given knowledge to help that regime to, to succeed. You can see that in Nigeria, as election is drawing near, many Muslims are at a dilemma as to whether to participate in the process or not. They are at a dilemma as to whether they should be seen, whether it is appropriate that they should be seen as further entrenching this democracy that has been adjudged as kufu. So you see that many Muslims, they are under a mental torture when they try to participate in democracy. They are like, am I even sinning against God or not? So I believe by the time we now apply the life history of Prophet Yusuf, we will see that if indeed we are believers who believe not just in Prophet Muhammad but believe in other prophets of God, we will see that we are allowed to freely live under a secular government. Not just, living under a secular government, we are also allowed to flourish under that government and even participate and use our God-given knowledge to help the, government and the society to succeed. Because frankly speaking, there is nothing you accuse democracy of that you will not find in the government that nurture Prophet Yusuf to prosperity. So that is why I am appealing to my fellow Muslims in Nigeria that we should free ourselves from that mental shackle, from that mental bondage that when I participate in democracy, I am actually sinning against God. No, because God does not lay a burden on a soul more than it can bear. And since we have found ourselves in a world where democracy is the order of the day, we have seen from the life history of Prophet Yusuf that we are at liberty to live freely under such a government, to flourish, and even, go ahead and participate in that government, to become an official in that government. Just like Prophet Yusuf became, a vice, or what do they call it, a prime minister under the government of Pharaoh, as long as our faith is not being persecuted. So we are free as Muslims to, join democracy and participate fully in it.